The highest world court is about to hear a landmark case that could dictate the course of future climate change talks. Over the next fortnight, the International Court of Justice will hear testimony from nearly 100 countries, and 12 international organisations will present their case over the obligations of states and organisations to protect the climate and the environment from greenhouse gas emissions.
And it'll be Vanuatu who will be leading the charge, representing other Pacific nations under threat of climate change. I spoke to Vanuatu's Special Envoy on Climate Change, Ralph Regennavu, just before he left for The Hague, and asked why the need to take the case to the ICJ.
Basically, it's because we have been frustrated by the UNFCCC process, which is the only United Nations mandated process to deal with the issue of climate change. And as we saw just last week in Baku, the voices of small island states and vulnerable nations, the ones that have not been responsible for climate change but are suffering the worst effects, are always overshadowed in climate negotiations. The results we need to survive are not being achieved. And so we wanted to go to somewhere like the International Court of Justice, which is the United Nations' highest legal organ, to stand as equals with the global superpowers, which is the way the court deals with all parties as equal, before the court to advocate for the change we want to see for climate change, because we're not getting it.
As I understand it, you will be presenting the case for Vanuatu at the ICJ. If you could just briefly outline your case for us, please.
So basically, our case is that the whole infrastructure of international law, which was established after World War II with the establishment of the UN and everything subsequent, is all about nation states cooperating to make a better world for everyone. And what we're saying is that the whole infrastructure of international law puts obligations on states to make sure they don't cause harm to other states, make sure they protect the environment, to make sure they protect the rights of future generations. And we're saying that many, many states right now are not doing that. They are in breach of their responsibilities and obligations as good international citizens. And that's what we want the ICJ to rule on. Are they good citizens or not? Because we have an international law. We always hear people talking about, the international rules-based order, but we're not seeing the countries follow them. The main countries that talk about the rules-based order, like Australia, like the US, like Europe, actually not following it when it comes to climate change. They are not doing what needs to be done to maintain a positive future for the world.
I read that the court has received written submissions from over 90 countries and organizations, including China, the US, and OPEC as well. Now, we understand that the court can only issue an advisory opinion, which won't be a binding ruling. That being the case, how effective would such an opinion be in forcing developed nations to fulfill their obligations to the Paris Accord?
For example, if the advisory opinion was to say that cumulative emissions and continuing to ratchet up emissions when the science tells us, and we have all agreed at Paris to reduce emissions, and you continue to do it, the advisory opinion may say that that is unlawful under international law. And if it says that, then we have a legal basis for holding countries accountable for their actions and inactions. And also we can narrow the arguments that can be made at the COPs, for example. We can say you can no longer speak about these kind of things, or these are the excuses you've been making, because under international law, the ICJ has clarified that those are not grounds to be argued upon. And so we're hoping that it will really provide much more legal clarity for us to stand upon to talk at these international forums, but also it'll provide a precedent for the literally hundreds of climate litigation cases that are happening all around the world against states, against fossil fuel majors, against state governments, that kind of thing.
Now, there's a new global fund that many would say acknowledges and goes some way to addressing loss and damage experienced by developing nations through climate change. Does that not hold the polluters to account?
It's an acknowledgement, but there is no fund at the moment. No one's accessed it. There is nothing to be accessed. And so it's an acknowledgement that, in fact, there is this need for, as the developing countries say, $1 trillion of loss and damage. And we're also referring to the IPCC, which is a leading world authority on what climate change impacts are, the science behind it. And so I would say the acknowledgement that there is loss and damage and there is a need for a fund is an acknowledgement that we do need substantial amounts of funding to go to assist the countries that have not caused climate change, like Vanuatu. We have contributed less than 1% of global emissions, and yet we're facing some of the worst impacts relative to our financial capacity as one of the least developed countries in the world. And there needs to be this funds transfer, and that was acknowledged and that was accepted and adopted by all countries at the Paris Agreement. They already agreed to that principle. So it's not something it's not a new thing. This is something that's been agreed upon. But the question is, are countries actually stepping up and undertaking their responsibilities as agreed at Paris?
We've just had COP29. We've seen the walkout by developing nations, and now we're seeing this landmark case being brought to The Hague. Is the message from the Global South getting louder? And more importantly, is that message being heard?
The Global South is loud. It's being heard. But whether it's making any impact is another question. Whether the forums available are adequate for whatever noise you make to be heard. And that's why we are choosing an alternative forum. We're going to the ICJ. We've seen what happens in COP. We're seeing that we're very loud, we're being heard, and yet the change that we're seeking is not happening. That's why we are going to a different forum to see if we can make the change happen there that we're not seeing at